There we go. All right, took a minute to get that thing going today. All right, gentlemen, we will be continuing our series here as we work our way through the miracles of Jesus in the book of John. We are making our way through. After today, we have two more official miracles, at least by the count of most people who do miracles, and then we'll probably grab some tail end of the book kind of stuff, but we'll get there when we get there. In many ways, our miracle today, once again in chapter 6 of John, is a continuation of last week's miracle. So we talked about how the narrative unit that we're in right here kind of has three parts to it. The first is Jesus feeding the 5,000, right? He crosses the sea to get to where he is, but we don't really even know where exactly he came from, which, among other things, tells us, hey, this is a new unit, if you will. And then without any breaks, we go directly into the miracle of the walking on the water. In fact, walking on the water occurs because of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. We'll touch on that. And then later, we will see, although we won't in this class look at it because that's one of Jesus' speeches, not one of his miracles, if you will, the bread of life discourse, as it's often called, where Jesus in some ways makes comment on the events that just happened, especially the feeding of the 5,000, but also, of course, teaching about himself and who he is, and kind of revealing more of that God revealed in the person of Christ. We touched on that last week with the feeding of the 5,000, that Jesus is in many ways paralleling the Passover account and showing himself as the greater Moses, right? We looked a little bit at Deuteronomy, that the first guy after Moses that's greater than Moses, that's the Messiah, right? Today, and again, into the bread of life discourse, Jesus is really going to, in no uncertain terms, show himself to be God in human form. We're going to see, if we haven't already in the feeding of the 5,000, we're going to see divinity on full display and attested to by Jesus in the walking on the water. You got something, Bill? Okay. Your look of focusing on what I'm saying and what is this guy talking about, I need to ask them a question, are very similar. So just to kind of set our scene here, right? We finished off the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, chapter 6, verse 15, where Jesus, perceiving then that that's the crowds, were about to take him by force to make him king, right? In contrast to when the Pharisees try and take Jesus by force to kill him. To make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So he goes back up the mountain. And then we have the next line, when evening came. So this is the same day. This is a continuing event. And in many ways, we see Jesus doing shadow tactics. He's given them this is a trick play in many counts, right? Jesus sends the disciples to the boat so that they can leave. So everyone thinks he's getting on the boat and leaving so that they start running around the sea so they can go meet him on the other side while Jesus is hiding him on the mountain. But before we get into any of that, can I have a volunteer to read the whole thing? It's very, there it is, Bill.
Well, just back up a minute. That always sounded like a strange narrative. They were going to take him by force to make him king.
Yeah.
You know?
And so why do you say that that's a strange narrative?
Well, I mean, it's a lofty position to be king, and they're going to take you by, say, well, do you like it or not?
It does sound humorous. This has happened outside of Jesus before. Not necessarily for king, although, you know what? There are two guys that I can think of historically that this happened to. The first is from the Rex Romana, right? So you guys know about the Roman Empire, right? Julius Caesar and all the events of the Bible. Before that, there was the Roman Republic, right? This is the thing Julius Caesar overthrew. This is like Scipio Africanus, and these guys. Before the Republic, the first government of Rome was the Rex Romana. They had kings in Rome. And during this time, the kings would, this is in the Republic. The Republic would appoint dictators, which is a really bad word for us, but in the original sense, during the Republic, the dictator was the emergency leader, right? So typically, you guys know this, how many people were in charge of the Roman Republic at any given time? It's like we have one president. What did Rome have? Do you guys know?
Emperor.
No, this is after. This is before that. So the emperor. The emperor is a separate thing, and that's after the fall of the Republic, right? They had 2 consuls, is what they were called, and there were 2 guys that were in charge, kind of to check each other in power. This is what Julius Caesar is messing around with and all the politics and stuff. It's very exciting. Well, what would happen is if something really bad was happening, national emergency, right? The Senate would elect a 3rd person to a 6-month term of dictator. And he had absolute authority. He didn't have to check in with the consuls. He didn't have to check in with the Senate. He was emperor, king, whatever you want to say, for 6 months to deal with the problem. The first of these was a guy named Cincinnaticus, right? It's a great name. And he is one of the greatest heroes of the Roman Empire, or of the Roman culture in general, across every era. Because Cincinnaticus, what he did is he was elected dictator. He went and dealt with I think it was the Etruscans that he was dealing with, but don't quote me on that. Dealt with the crisis of the invasion, and then he put everything down before his 6 months was up and returned to his plow. And he was the greatest Roman ever to exist ever, right? But so here's someone who they made king and then gave it up. By the way, Cincinnaticus sounds like a city in the United States, doesn't it?
Yeah, Cincinnati.
Cincinnati. That's on purpose. Cincinnati was named by some people in the early history of the United States because there was someone that the American Senate, if you will, of the American politics, tried to make king who refused it. Who is that?
It wasn't George Washington, was it?
Bingo, it was George Washington. So they did try to make him king. He said no. Then they elected him president twice, and then he said no more, right? And of course, the term limits weren't there. And he refused and then went back to his farm, right? And so there was a group of people who founded a city in honor of George Washington and named it Cincinnati because he was the Cincinnaticus of our time. So there's your fun fact. Cincinnati is named after George Washington. You can confuse all your friends. That's true. In the church, though, there is some history of this guy named Ambrose of Milan, who's one of the major doctors of the church. I've talked about him before. He was one of the Advent saints I did in an Advent series a number of years ago. He was a politician in Milan when the bishop died. And at this point in time, the bishop of Milan was effectively the pope. He was more influential than Rome. That's where the capital of Rome was too, right? It wasn't always in Rome. It's a whole weird thing. Well, the people really liked Ambrose. The problem was he was a catechumen. He wasn't baptized yet. But they said, "We want you to be bishop," and he said, "Absolutely not." He utterly refused, and then a mob dragged him out of his political office, basically force baptized him, sent him through 1 week of seminary so that he could be a priest, and then appointed him bishop against his will.
Goodness.
So this kind of thing does happen occasionally. And of course, every dictator has also been forced into the position by the people, right? At least that's how the story goes. But that's a whole different thing. So yeah, it does seem strange that Jesus, they're trying to force him into this role of king. I think it's included, that John includes this detail to kind of show the disparity of reactions to Jesus, right? On the one side, you have people who find out who Jesus is, or their version of it, right? They get a piece of it, and they want to kill him for it, right? Which is, and this is going to sound strange, so let me finish the sentence, which is the correct reaction if Jesus isn't who he says he is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, assuming Jesus wasn't the Son of God and God and all of that, the things he said were utterly blasphemous and deserving of death, right? The only difference is it was true, right? So having that little piece is enough to send the Pharisees towards, we need to kill him. And that'll eventually be the one that wins out, right? Obviously the cross, we know that. And it's after raising Lazarus from the dead that the Pharisees are done. Like, there's no other options. We're not having conversations anymore. He's got to die. But the other reaction to Jesus is an earthly adoration, let's say. A desire to make him king in a very earthly sense. And there's some correct aspect of this, right? I mean, we recognize that this is what the Messiah is here to do, right? All those Isaiah passages.
He would hang out with the poor and with the sinners like the elite.
Well, right, yeah. And well, the elite did, that's why the elite weren't the ones.
Make him a king for all people.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, we see those Isaiah passages around Christmas, right? You know, he's the Prince of Peace and all of that kind of thing. Stewing around in the background is, in many ways, there's some political stuff that is influencing both of these reactions, right? I mean, yes, the Pharisees had this religious zeal, and so someone who was a blasphemer needed to die because of that, but that's not really the whole, I'll say, of why they want to get rid of Jesus. And it's not why the crowds, the masses, want to make him king. Both of these have in the background a hatred of Rome and a dislike of Rome. This is easiest to see with the crowds, right? We know this. The crowd, Simon Zealot, and all these kind of people wanted to make Jesus king so he could kick out the Romans, right? Reestablish God's kingdom on earth, just like the good old days, right? Reading the Old Testament, I'm not sure they were that good of days, but anyway, that's a different story, right? Just like the good old days. The Pharisees are in a little bit more of a nuanced position. So the Pharisees do have some political authority and power. Not a lot in the grand scheme of things. I mean, they're subject to Rome, obviously. They're also subject largely to the Herodians, which kind of won the game of politics just before Jesus was born. But they still have some power and authority. They don't want to give that up, what they have. And Jesus is, in the most political sense, Jesus is someone who is going to upset the political apple cart that they may not like, but it's safe for them. I mean, does that make sense? They have a homeostasis, they have some authority, they have some clout. Yeah, it's not what we like, but the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, right? And there's also the fact that the Pharisees do have an idea of what happens if Jewish nationalism, if you will, goes too far. It's not in the biblical time frame, although there's possibly an actor, if you will, from this event in the Gospels. We're not 100% sure. But shortly before the birth of Christ, we're looking at like maybe 5 years before Jesus was born or so, there was someone who claimed to be the Messiah and led a rebellion against Rome. It didn't go very well, and a lot of people were crucified. And it's possible that Barabbas is a prisoner from that rebellion. There have also been a number of riots, basically, that have come up throughout Jesus' lifetime and shortly before. And they've all ended badly, basically for everyone involved. It ends with a lot of Jewish people dead, because at some point, that's how the Romans deal with this, right? Even when it's their own fault, right? Like one prefect sacrifices a pig in the rebuilt temple because he's trying to show the supremacy of Rome, and then he burns incense to the Caesar as well. That doesn't go over well, as you might imagine. And there's a riot, and he calls in the guard, and they just start killing people. And that's how that gets put down. What then happens, just so we can get a good complete picture, what then happens is Rome, right? The Romans back in Rome are not happy with this. They want stability in the province of Judea. Anyone remember why? Here's the $1 million question. Why are they so concerned with Judea being stable?
Wasn't it a major trade hub?
It was kind of, but that's not why. It's because on the other side of Judea from the Romans were the Parthians, which are like the big bad guys for the Romans.
Gotcha.
So
they were like the buffer between the real...
That is exactly what they were. And that's why Herod has his own sort of area, because Rome initially was like, we're not going to actually be in control of this. We're going to let you be in power, and you take the brunt of any time the Parthians try and come in. That's kind of the quid pro quo thing going on, right? So the Romans do not want unrest in Judea, because if there is unrest, the Parthians could leverage that, take advantage, or it just makes their border weak. So what happens is basically every time there's an insurrection or a riot or things,
Squash it.
not only do they squash it, but the guy in charge of the Pontiff, right? He has to go answer back at Rome, and what do you know? They just keep falling off the ship in the Mediterranean. It's crazy, right? Pontius Pilate is like the 13th in line, and I think like 9 of the guys before him die under mysterious circumstances. And by that, I mean they didn't handle politics well, and so the Romans, who are, remember, the mob, on a really big scale, they just kill them on the way back and tell the next guy, you know what happens if you mess up.
Or maybe some of them jumped.
No, no.
They wouldn't commit suicide? No.
I mean, they probably would have, but that would have been more honorable. Anyway,
Gotcha.
at least in their mind. We know that Pontius Pilate is on a short leash, by the way, just before the events of most of the New Testament. This is during Jesus' lifetime. Pilate gets the great idea of putting a Roman eagle up outside of the temple, which is basically saying Rome is greater than God, or God to the Jews. And there's a revolt, and Pilate is basically told, hey buddy, 2 strikes and you're out. Don't mess this thing up again. Which is, I think, part of the reason why Pilate is really freaking out when the whole, Holy Week thing happens.
Oh, yeah.
He's in a powder keg. He's on a short leash with his neck on the line. Everyone is in Jerusalem all at the same time for the Passover, and now you have multiple groups of dissidents in his mind, right, that are barely being kept in check, all getting ready to just blow. And on top of that, do you guys remember what actually sets Pilate over the edge and makes him wash his hands? Remember what the crowd say?
No.
Right.
Friend of Caesar.
No, right. And not only that, but
We have no king but Caesar.
he said, we have no king of Caesar, and if you don't kill this man who says he is king
You are
in
no
defiance
friend
of Caesar,
Caesar.
you're not a friend of Caesar, which now has Now Pilate is in a rock and a hard place. He can either go to bat for Jesus, which he's kind of been doing, not for faith reasons. Remember what happened less than a week before. There were massive crowds welcoming this guy in and calling him king and doing all of these things that really looked like a revolt about to happen. And now there's another group of people, who knows how much he realizes are the same people, who are now saying, if you don't kill him, you are in rebellion against Caesar. He has no good option, so he washes his hands and leaves. Which doesn't, a revolt does not happen there. So, I mean, I guess, who knows, maybe he dodged that bullet. But, yeah, things are, Pilate's in a really just terrible spot.
I almost felt bad for him at one time because it's like the whole world, he's got the weight of this on his shoulder, and he goes to his wife to try to get some comfort. She says, I had a dream, don't have nothing to do with that guy.
Right, he's like, thanks,
oh,
honey.
man, I'm
Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy, right? I'm stuck here. Right, and well, this is why Caesar I keep saying Caesar. This is why Pilate has Jesus whipped, right? I'm not going to kill him, but I'm going to almost kill him.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll be sufficient, right? And then it's not. So he has him mocked publicly. Like, okay, is that enough? No. And he goes, okay, I think I know how I'll let the cooler heads here prevail. I'll pull out a war criminal, right? A terrorist who fought in this insurrection, killed a whole bunch of people, was causing big problems. And I'll say, who do you want? This guy that's done nothing wrong that I can tell, or the terrorist? And then they say, oh, give us the terrorist. And you can almost see Pilate just ripping his hair out. He's like, what do you want? And he kind of says it. He says, what do you want from me? Like, what will make this problem go away? And I say, kill him. You gotta crucify him. And then, right, he has to then deal with the politics of the situation, right? And I didn't see, maybe we get
an hour and a half.
Yeah. But that's kind of what's going on here. So you see these crowds that they want to make him king. This is a rebellious sort of attitude, which is part of the reason why it's so problematic and Jesus has to disappear. Yes, it's because his kingdom's not of this world and all these other things that we learn later. But if Jesus lets them have their way, he is now in open rebellion, basically. And he's the leader of a rebellion. And other than the whole, sinless aspect and not rebelling against authority sort of thing, that throws off the plan, if you will, right? The mission of Christ, which is to die to save the world. So he just can't have that. It is just as problematic for the mission of Jesus, if you will, if the Pharisees kill him early, as it is if the masses make him king. Both of these are salvation-ending events. And so he disappears. He says, nope, not doing that. I'm going up on the mountain. Disciples go, red herring, lead them away. Right? That answer your comment, Bill? Wasn't even really a question. But I made it take 20 minutes. Look at that. Good. Now, would someone like to read 16 through 21, please?
When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. When they got into the boat and set it off across the lake for Capernaum. But now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew up. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." When they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed.
All right. So, yes.
A couple of weeks ago, I went to the funeral of a very good friend of mine, and it was a mainline denomination. And the lady preacher used this text for the sermon, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't get the connection And she never did make a connection.
I think I know what the connection is. Maybe.
She didn't mention my friend's death or Jesus
Well,
or the resurrection. Or,
yeah. Well, I will say the reason I had this book open is because I got a quote that probably fits that direction. Maybe. There's probably two ways you can take it. That one's probably the better one. So we'll assume that that's what she was working towards. But yeah, I mean, this is a problem with public speaking in general and preaching in particular, which is the speaker knows what they're talking about and knows how they're connecting the dots in their own mind. And they know where their starting point was and they know where their ending point is. And sometimes you can forget to take people along the journey with you. Or you're starting at such a completely different place. I guarantee she was like, oh, this is the perfect text. I know exactly why. And you're sitting there like, none of us know why. It'll fill us in, right? And like I said, that's something that's hard with speaking in general, especially like persuasive speaking, which is kind of what sermons fall into categorically. But yeah, that's a struggle for.
I took it as a randomly picked text.
Probably wasn't, right? I mean, I would assume it's not. But who knows, right?
That's what I mentioned. Pastors.
Anyway, so interesting. I mean, I think this is the shortest miracle account in John. It's just a couple of verses long, very quick. And like I said, directly on the narrative heels of the feeding of the 5,000. We don't really have, I mean, I know you all have a break with those nice big bold letters of your heading, but in the text, there's no disconnect between these two miracles. It's one directly into another, which I believe this is the only miracle account that in John that does that. None of the other ones are, some of them are back to back. Those two healings, the official's son and the man with dropsy at the pool of Bethesda. They're back to back, but they're separated narratively from one another. These aren't. And so we're moving straight into feeding the 5,000 into Jesus walking on the water.
So he walked on the water twice? Well, I remember the part where he's walking on the water and Peter came.
Mhm.
Is this a different account?
It's a different account.
It's the same circumstance, but told by
Yes.
two
So there are three accounts. So
Okay.
feeding the 5,000 is in all of the Gospels.
Yes.
Walking on the water is in 3. It's in Matthew, which is the one with Peter. It's here in John, and it's in Mark. Right? Luke doesn't have it.
But
Okay.
that was all the same time. It wasn't a
Ye-
different, pretty much.
Yes, I don't know of anyone who thinks that this is a repeated miracle.
Again, each evangelist focuses on the details that they most want to communicate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, this was something. I'm glad you brought it up now. This is something that was going to come up as we looked through in detail. There's something. It's called gospel synergism, which I think we've talked a little bit about this before. And what gospel synergism is it is an attempt to take at least the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and combine them into like a master gospel, right? Where you fill in the details that are missing in other ones. I have one. It's called Gospel Parallels is the name of this old book that I have. And what it does, the way it does, it doesn't actually combine the text, but it has all 4 gospels side by side. So it'll have a whole bunch of stuff from Luke at the beginning, right? The whole nativity scene, and it's just the Luke column, and there's nothing else, right? And then when we get to Jesus' baptism, we get a whole bunch of other ones that are running side by side, and so it lays it out that way. And I think that one's not bad. In general, while you can get some helpful things out of gospel synergism, I think it is a misplaced venture. And we shouldn't try too hard to do it. The reason being, like Joe said, these authors are including the things that they are including and the details that they are including for a reason. There's a purpose behind what they are telling, the order that they tell it in, and the details that they include and leave out, right? And sometimes this lands in the world of contradiction where things don't quite fit. I think the easiest example of this is Jesus cursing the fig tree. I don't remember which one it is, but in one of the Gospels, Jesus curses the fig tree as he's on his way into Jerusalem. And in another one of the Gospels, he curses the fig tree on his way out of Jerusalem. Well, which one is it? Did he do it twice? That's not the point. So what we should rather ask is, why has the author placed this scene where he has? What's the purpose? Why is he doing it this way? And the modern mindset really doesn't like this, sees it as contradictory, or, it often gets brought up as things like this, where the Gospels kind of do contradict each other, particularly in narrative flow. Some people see this as reasons to believe that the Bible has errors in it. This is a modern way to understand things imposed on an ancient book. I mean, the Gospels are 2,000 years old, give or take, right? Authors at this time don't view historical accuracy in the same way that we do. That is to say that if, let's say, Jesus, in historical fact, cursed the fig tree on the way into Jerusalem. Well, whoever it was, because I don't remember, that said he did it on the way out, he remembered that story, or he heard about that story, and he decided for a thematic reason to change it. It's still all the same stuff, it's still real, and they wouldn't have seen that as like rewriting history or anything. Just, I'm trying to make a bigger point about Jesus.
To me, that's not a big deal at all. It's not like, some people will be, aha!
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people that this is a big problem for. Also, for what it's worth, the Gospels are not history books, right? Yeah. Their goal is not to give a historical accounting of Jesus' life. This isn't a biography, right? Yeah. They're written for the purpose of faith and teaching who Jesus is.
Were they written roughly at the same time?
The Gospels? They were written within 100 years of each other. So most often, John is identified as the last of the Gospels written. There's a lot of good reasons to think that. And it could have been written as late as 100 AD. We know John was very old. He, like you said, I think John was the last book of the Bible written, full stop, right? But we know John was alive, likely in the year 100.
Probably the youngest of all the disciples.
Yeah, and he's by far the oldest of them as well.
Sure.
And so we think that John was probably the last one written. Which one was the first? There's a toss-up between Matthew and Mark. I tend to think Mark was written down first, but I think Matthew has an older tradition, which is to say that I think Matthew was an oral history first, and then it was put down on paper. And there's some reasons why we think this. This whole conversation, what I don't want you to hear is, I'm trying to get around biblical inerrancy, or, there's some secret gospel that was written, I don't know, let's call it Q, that we haven't found any evidence for, but Matthew used it as a source, which is a thing, don't worry about it. Like I said, there's no evidence of it, physical, so probably didn't exist. Anyway, no, these are historically accurate texts. They're just not written as a modern history book. Just like they're not modern science textbooks. I mean, like that's not the genre that these are written in. And they're written not only in a different cultural context, as in with a more Eastern mindset, which is less about facts and figures and detail and more about theme and purpose and far more poetry kind of view, whereas a Western mindset is, analytical, and there's decimal points and you have to know precisely what happened when, scientific method stuff. Well, there's also that time difference. We are post-scientific method, we are post-enlightenment, and that has really changed the way we read things, and we think about narratives and stuff like that. It's not wrong, it's just different. So it's worth understanding those differences. And so, for instance, right, I'll lay this out and then we'll come back to it. The disciples are afraid when they see Jesus walking on the water. There's going to be a question of why are they afraid? And the reason they're afraid is not the same as it is in the book of Mark. I'll just say that now. In the book of Mark, they think he's a ghost. It flat out says phantasm, right, is the Greek word that shows up there. They think Jesus is a ghost, and so they freak out because there's a ghost coming out. I want us to avoid that, because that's not why they're afraid in John. At no point do they think Jesus is a ghost, but they are still afraid. So why are they afraid? And we'll get to that. So that's something let's be careful of, right? And it's kind of like with the allegory thing that I've talked a little bit about. Doing some of this synergism stuff is not bad. But let's first take the gospel within its own context. Then we can, once we've learned what we can, if you will, then we can take some others in and say, oh, well, where does Peter walking on the water out to Jesus, how does that fit into this? How do all these other sorts of aspects, what can they inform us?
No human man could walk on water, so they must have been like, for sure, it's, God, that would terrify me.
Well, and we don't see it here. I think it's the Matthew text. Maybe, yeah, it would want to be the Mark one. No, it's the calming of the sea, which is a different thing. They start worshiping Jesus, which means they are identifying him as God. Because Jews don't worship anyone but God at this point in time, right? So when they say, they bow down and worship Jesus, two things you can glean from that. One is that the disciples think he's God. And so when you do hear some critics of the Bible say, oh, the disciples made up this whole Jesus being God thing way later. No. If you're going to take their stories, their accounts at face value, no, they don't. In the Bible, they are calling Jesus God there through their actions. And the second is that Jesus doesn't stop them, which kind of goes against this whole Arian sort of view that, well, Jesus is some heavenly being or someone sent by God, but he's not really God. If that's true, then Jesus would have stopped the worship of himself, which we know because angels do it regularly. Angels tell people to stop worshiping them because angels know they are not things to be worshipped. They are creatures just like, that's what in John is. I'm a fellow servant, I'm a fellow creature, don't worship me, John. And then he's got to tell him twice. But don't worship me, worship God. And Jesus doesn't do that. Which, by the way, is one of the ways in the Old Testament, whenever someone falls down and worships an angel, like Joshua and the man outside of Jericho, and the angel doesn't say, stop it, it's because it's Jesus. Anyway, or the pre-incarnate Christ. But we're getting far afield here. So, we kind of start this narrative. Jesus is up on the mountain, and the disciples are in a boat. They're rowing across the Sea of Galilee and what happens to them? What is their situation? John describes it using kind of two phrases.
Rough water and strong wind.
I'm going to say that that's one thing. I know you had two. There's a storm. What else does John say? Verse 17 is where it appears.
It was dark.
It was dark.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And I'll be honest, this is an easy thing to just skim over. But let's remember, we got to look at the whole narrative of John. Why is John giving these details? Well, it was night, yes. But why does John, he's already said it's evening. He doesn't need to say that it's dark. So what is darkness in the book of John? Where else does it appear?
Sin.
Darkness is sin, yes. Yes, but I think it's more nuanced, perhaps, or more broad, maybe. It appears right in the beginning of the book, right? He was the light that came into the darkness, and the darkness could not understand it. So darkness is in opposition to Christ and God and who Jesus is, right? Talks about being the light of the world, right? And these sorts of things. And so the disciples, where are they?
They're in a boat.
They're in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, yes, but more importantly, where aren't they? It's a weird question, but you know the answer. Well, they are not with Jesus. They're in the dark, both literally, and they're away from the light of the world. They are alone. And they are not just in the dark, they are in a tempestuous sea.
So to see that it was Jesus, they would have had to see him as light.
That's not where I was going, but I think there's some reality to that.
Yeah.
So we have this rough and turbulent sea. Now this is going back a little bit. As we are looking for context to help us understand more things about our text. Do you guys remember the order and how you do this? Right? So you look to the stuff around it, right? We've been doing that. We know the narrative, right? And then you look within the book. We just did that with the darkness. We used John chapter 1 to help inform us on this darkness thing. And then what's the next zoom out, if you will? What do you think? Put it this way, you can't do it for every book, but you can for John. So first you start with the immediate context, then you go to the whole book, and then
The other things that he wrote.
the other things that the guy wrote, right? So then you go within the same author, right? We do this with Paul all the time. We let Paul help us inform. It's the same guy wrote it. He's thinking the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and I know you're far better versed in this. When we hear or when we see Paul use some weird word, the first thing we do is, well, what else was he talking about when he used this word to kind of help us understand what he means when he says it, right? So here we go to the other things that the author wrote. So we got 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation, right? Which of these other books does the sea appear in? Revelation, yeah, absolutely. And we see it in contrast. This is, we see the vision of the sea first, although there is a tempestuous sea later, but that's because giant meteors are falling in it and stuff. We see the sea first in the vision of the heavenly throne room, where the floor is the glass of the sea. And then the lamb with 7 eyes and horns and stuff appears there. And we noted when we went through the Revelation text that the glassiness of the sea is meant to conjure this image of a calm sea. Because what does biblically, and we'll zoom out even further here, right? And we can look at all other places the sea appears in the Bible. What imagery, what purpose does the sea play from a narrative standpoint in the rest of the Bible? Well, think about times that you see the sea. You like those homonyms or homophones. Anyway, what are other places in the Bible that the sea makes an appearance?
Flood.
The flood, right? What's happening in the flood? Is that a calm sea? No. And what is God doing in the flood?
He's ridding the world of sin.
He's bringing judgment on the world. Absolutely. Good. So, what's another place that we see the sea in the Bible?
Red Sea.
That's the next one as far as I can remember. And what is God doing with the sea there? This one's a little bit more nuanced than the flood. So he parts the Red Sea. What's the purpose of that? It's also not a calm sea, right? Because, and here's a good note, what is the mechanism that God uses to part the sea? Because we do know this.
Moses.
It's the wind, right? Yes, Moses is God's agent, but when he lifts the staff, it says a strong east, or a strong wind comes and parts the sea. Yeah, strong winds again. But I'm sure John had that in mind, at least a little bit, right? But what is God doing with the Red Sea that's not calm? This one has two aspects of it.
He's helping his people escape.
He's delivering his people on dry land, right? That always comes up, right? The feet don't get wet. But anyway, so what else does God use the Red Sea to do?
Destroy Pharaoh's army.
To bring judgment on the Egyptians, right? Good. Another example of a sea in the Old Testament. I'll do at least one more that I got in my head, unless you can think of some other ones.
Well, the saints, or is it the elders, they're casting down their crowns upon the glassy sea? Isn't that?
That's that Revelation image, and that's going to help us here, but it's going to be the other half of this image, right? You know it. There's a DVD for the VeggieTales version of it up right over there.
Oh, Jonah.
Jonah! Bingo! Right? And it's a stormy sea. What does God use the sea to do? You guys know this. Why is the storm there in the book of Jonah?
Well, they tossed him out of the boat because they figured he offended God.
Okay, so God is using it to bring judgment. By the way, they're right about that. The prophet, anyway, Jonah's a super cool book. We did Jonah last year. And then what happens to the sea once the judgment has occurred? Jonah gets thrown in. Goes calm. It's fine. Right? So rough seas in the minds of the Israelites, in the minds of the authors of the Bible, is God judging the world. It is the separation between God and man, and especially rough waters are the waters of judgment. By the way, this is not a unique image to Israelites. Now, as a largely landlocked people, it was a pretty significant image for them. The sea was bad, and they didn't really have any good things about the ocean, other than God was in control of it. And so that's kind of good, I guess, but it shows more of his might than anything else. But other ethnicities of people, I mean, the Greeks have this, Poseidon is not easy to get along with God. He is a vicious, angry, and capricious God. Now, the Greeks, partly because they do so much on the sea, they have a more nuanced view of the sea. But most ancient people, and I think even modern sailors to an extent, the sea is a place of judgment. It's a dangerous place, right? You learn very quickly, even when you're on a gigantic vessel, that you're really not in control of things, right? So we have this rough and tempestuous sea. So the disciples are in the dark, they're away from Jesus, and they are on this place of judgment, right? Right, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. All right. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is where I was supposed to read my quote. So this is where I think your person might have been going here, maybe. So Cyril has this great little section that he has to comment on them in the rough sea. He says this, and it's spiritualized interpretation, right? Those who are not with him, Jesus, are therefore hit by a storm. They are cut off or seem to be absent from him due to the fact that they have left the divine laws and are separated by sin from the one who is strong enough to save them. So, if being in spiritual darkness is heavy and drowning in the bitter sea of pleasures is hard to bear, let us receive Jesus. This will free us from danger and from the sin that leads to death. The type of what we just said will be seen in what happens. He will surely come to his disciples. What I was thinking of is actually further into here, and it's very long, so I'm not going to directly quote it. So I'm getting ahead of myself even for you. No, one of the options, which I think is the less good one, is this idea of in mourning, and when you face loss, you can feel kind of lost in this sea. Cling to Jesus, right? Because he's the only one that can deliver you from that. So, disciples, who do they see? They're on the boat, they're frightened, they're on the boat, things are going badly for them. It doesn't actually say they're frightened yet. They become frightened when they see what? When they see Jesus. Who do they think they see? So in Mark, like I said, they think they're seeing a ghost. Right? They think they're seeing a phantasm.
Oh, right.
So we're ignoring that right now. Because it's easy for us to import that into John. But John doesn't
Do they
say
think it
that.
was a ghost of Jesus or just a ghost? Just a ghost, perhaps.
I don't think it's either. Who does John say that they see? Or they think they see, if you will. This is a question so straightforward that you're missing it.
They saw Jesus.
Who do they think they see coming?
Jesus.
Jesus. This is a significant little phrase, right? Now, like I said, we kind of import the other stories really quick because we know them so well. And that's just a natural thing. The disciples see Jesus, and what is their reaction? Fear. Why? First of all, is it the right and correct reaction? No. they have something wrong here. So let's kind of back up. Let's try and put ourselves in the minds of the disciples. For lunch, Jesus fed you with the loaves and the fish, right? Maybe it was dinner. I don't know. Right? Jesus has just fed you, and the crowds around you wanted to make him king. Who do you think Jesus is at this point? And for all the other miracles that you've seen, how are you as a disciple identifying Jesus?
The Messiah.
The Messiah, even more than that, though. Who has John been building Jesus up to be from the very beginning? Savior, God, right? I don't think the disciples missed this fact. I think that, at least in the book of John, I think they're still recognizing Jesus is God. Okay? So, let's look at this again. The disciples, in the storm, in the darkness, see God coming towards them. And they are afraid. Why?
Because they left it on land.
He told them to, but I think you're kind of getting in the right direction there. All right, forget about this. You are on a boat. You are a good Jewish person. Yeah, you do some fishing, but the sea is not a place that you enjoy being, right? It is a place of judgment and destruction and wrath. You're on a boat, and the storm is hitting hard, right? And you see God walking towards you. What's going through your mind?
Maybe we should have stayed there and waited for him.
Okay, so, right, but again, Jesus sent you, so that's not it.
I don't know.
What do you think he's coming to do? No, because then they wouldn't be frightened. So if again, is that what Jesus is coming to do? Yes, but they don't know that yet, right? So if it's not coming to save them, because they don't know that that's what it is, what might God be coming to do in their minds that frightens them?
Judgment.
Bingo. Oh crap, this is it. We're done. God's coming after us, right? And I'm sure they're running through everything they did wrong in their head, and maybe they're confused, like, hey, I thought this was good. Clearly it's not, right? Because I'm in this place of, right? Because who causes the storms? Right? I know we have pressure systems and blah, 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 blah. That's not what they thought, right?
God causes
God. And we see this very clearly in Jonah, where the tempest is thrown by God. God throws the storm at Jonah, right? This is how ancient people believed, right? God made the rainfall, God made the sunshine. Now, we know that there's real truth to that. We also know that there's, global effects and things like that, pressure waves and moisture and all that. But in the end, I mean, it's true. The storm is storming because God made it storm, right? So they're in the midst of God's judgment. He's the one that caused that judgment, and now he's coming towards them. And so they are frightened. God's going to destroy me. I'm done, right? Similar to when Isaiah gets whisked up into the throne room. It's like, I'm toast. This is it. Goodbye, cruel world. I'm done, right? The disciples fear.
Moses before the burning bush.
Right, yeah. Every time, like, these are sinners in the presence of God. They are afraid because they know that they're not supposed to be there. And the disciples have the added context of they're in darkness and a storm. And those are things that God does to people he is judging, right? They are not dry like the Israelites walking through the Red Sea. It's been splashing and everything. All right? So, come near the boat, and they were frightened. Jesus is coming at us. He's coming to judge us. What does Jesus say? Right? And no, I should have, I jumped the gun. What does Jesus do? Right? He speaks to them. Right? Because who is Jesus? He is the Word. Faith comes by hearing, right? We're getting all these sorts of things. So Jesus calls out to them. He speaks his word to them. What does he say? Yes?
It is I.
So close. And this is not your fault, because your translations aren't good.
Ego and me.
He says, ego e me. Which, that should be a phrase that you guys are starting to recognize. He says, he does not say, it is I. He says, I am. Do not be afraid. He uses the divine name, right? And especially in John, whenever Jesus uses the divine name, this is the same thing he says when he says, before Abraham was, ego e me. That get them to freak out, right? He says, I am. He says, Yahweh, don't be afraid. And then they were glad, right? So that solves the problem for them. Is it still stormy?
It says right away they're at the land. So.
So I'm even before that. But what doesn't it say?
There was a great calm.
Yeah, we don't get any calm in this text. At no point does the sea settle down. Even when the disciples recognize Jesus, right, they're still in the midst of this darkness and judgment.
Oh.
But now they're not afraid anymore, right? There's no calming of the sea here. Now, did the sea get calm? I don't know. It does in the other account, so probably. But does John care about that at all? No. This is kind of what Cyril's getting at here. So when you're in the midst of the struggles of life and the waves of sin and the darkness and your spirit is dark, That's where you need Jesus, right? And it doesn't just magically fix it all and make it go away. But Jesus is there, and now it's okay, right? Why is it okay? Why is Jesus saying, Ego eimi, I am Yahweh, don't be afraid? Why is that enough to settle the disciples? Well, who is Yahweh? Who is God to the Israelites, to the people of God?
They're Savior.
Bingo. And here, now we got it. Right? Yahweh is the God who saves. Right? He's not the God of judgment. I mean, judgment happens, right? We talk alien work of God and that kind of stuff. Like, judgment is a very real thing. But when Jesus here, God, speaks out his name, he says, I'm Yahweh, right? He is saying, I'm here to save you. You're fine. Salvation is here. Deliverance, right? This is the God who doesn't abandon his people, who doesn't leave them alone to judgment, right? He is calling to mind all of these promises that he has made to them. And the promise, most of all, that he is their Savior, not their judge, right? Remember, John 3:16 and following, or 3:17, I think, right?
3:17.
Yeah, for this one in particular. Yeah, he's not coming into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world, right? Yeah, and so he's calling, and John 3:17 is not the first time in the Bible that God has talked about being the Savior of his people, right? He does it a lot in the first 2/3, right? And that's what he's calling to mind here. So that is why when Jesus says, I am, don't be afraid, the disciples are glad now. They're okay. Like, okay, I'm not worried about the storm. I'm not worried about the darkness. Mm-hmm. Jesus is here. He's my Savior. It's going to be fine. Right? And then, so here's this fun little detail, right? John's the only one that says this, and it's really weird. Right? It's that verse 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So there's two details here that are of interest. We'll do the second one first, which is that how would you describe it in your words? I'm just curious about this.
What do you mean?
So rephrase that sentence to me. They're glad to take Jesus into the boat, and immediately they were where they were going.
Before they knew it, they were in the water.
Yeah.
Off the water.
What verb would you use to describe that? I'm getting at something in particular here that's really not that important, but I would say they were teleported there, right? They're transported. I think I find this interesting because going through the early church, they don't use that word because they haven't seen Star Trek. It's unreasonable of them. What were they doing with their time? They say, at great speed they arrive. Anyway, this is just
a supernatural event, you mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is another miracle, right? Immediately the boat was there. They pop. They're either Jesus goes full-blown speedboat with them, which I don't think is the case. I think they just appeared. They stopped being where they were, and they appeared on the other side.
The sea was more than 4 miles. I think it was like 8.
That's how far they'd gone out.
Yeah. But I'm saying they went like 3 or 4 miles, and then this happened, and boom, they're at land.
Yeah. And to be fair, this is not the only time in the Bible that that God has teleported people.
Yeah.
Right.
Since it was dark, they might have been at the shore.
They might have already been there, just not known. Ever the practical man there, Bill. But anyway, this isn't the only time where God teleports people in the Bible. And does anyone know any of the other ones? There's 2 that I know of.
Ezekiel.
3. Ezekiel. And it happens with the same guy more than once. Or it happens one time for sure with him, and someone thinks it's going to happen another time. And this is Elijah. So Elijah's under a broom tree, and he's like, God, just kill me now. And then, poof, he's on Mount Sinai. Just appears there. And Obadiah, which is not the Obadiah that has a book of the Bible named after him, but is a prophet in the court of King Ahab, finds Elijah right before Mount Carmel. And Elijah says, go tell Ahab that I'm here. And Obadiah goes, no, because God's going to disappear you off to somewhere else.
And what about, what was it, Philip and the eunuch? From,
yeah, oh, you're right. And then Philip gets taken away from him, right, and appears in Jerusalem or something like that.
I think so.
I don't know. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, so
Fascinating.
God teleports people, which is something we don't think about very often, but it happens, and I'm sure that's a wild experience. So that's the second interesting thing that happens here, and miraculous in and of itself, right? But also, okay, yeah. There was something else, but that's a different. Anyway, we'll get to that later. Where is Jesus when this happens? So summarize the narrative for me, right? Disciples go out. They see Jesus. They're afraid. Jesus says, I am. And then what happens next?
They're in Capernaum.
Well, so we know that they do appear over there. Actually, that is not how I read it, but that is how a lot of people have read it.
Well, I was just glancing through here in this study Bible. And it was,
Yeah. So how many of you read, then Jesus got in the boat and then they appeared? This doesn't actually say that. Which I'm not super convinced about this, but the author of the comment, the big blue commentary, says that the reason the word immediately is there is to prove to us that Jesus doesn't even bother to get in the boat. As soon as they are glad to have him, and say, come on, Jesus, poof, they're there. He doesn't even get in the boat. Does this matter, right?
Now, my Lutheran study Bible
It says
says
they were willing to take him in the boat.
Right, yeah. The only detail we have is that they are willing, that they're happy to have him there, right?
So he just pushed them.
Yeah, well, it's like, and again, this is, I think, like I said, I'm not terribly convinced, but I mean, we're really digging into the word, so maybe I should be. But maybe this is just a part of like, the other accounts, because he gets in the boat in all the other ones, right? And so he had to have, right? But it doesn't say that. Now, I don't have a great, grand, and wonderful insight based on that. So, good. Any questions that you guys have? And then we'll hit some of this other stuff that Cyril does with this account. I think it's pretty cool. All right. So Cyril, let me see if I can find the actual quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but all right, let's see. Okay, here we go. Cyril has this great thing, and it kind of goes to what I talked about earlier, right? We take each, as we're interpreting the Bible, we take it at its face value first, and then we can kind of go to some more spiritual stuff. And so Cyril, before he does that, says this: now, since we have discussed each element of the passage individually, let us join the interpretation of the elements with the sequence of what came before and work out the spiritual interpretation, right? So say, now that we know what happened and we've thought about what happened and we've learned about what happened, let's do some allegory stuff, right? And I think, again, this is, you've got to be a little careful, but I think it's helpful here. And I think this is, if I were to preach this, maybe this is at a funeral, maybe this is where I would go. So Cyril takes this whole account and kind of looks to a deeper meaning and imagery, if you will. So he says that what's the first thing that Jesus does in our account, even though it's verse 15, not 16? He ascends the mountain, right? You know of any other time that Jesus ascended? At the ascension, yeah. So Cyril says, well, just like Jesus ascended the mountain in this text, he ascended into heaven as well. And so we should be reminded of that, right? And then what happens to the disciples as Jesus ascends? The faithful believers in Jesus are alone in a boat, right? And what's the boat? This might be tricky for you, but this is a very, very common image, so you may as well learn it now. What is the boat representative of? Well, where are all the disciples of Jesus, in the broad sense, where do they all gather together? You're really close, Bill. The church. In fact, this is intentional in the architecture of churches that aren't ours. And it's also structural, but the intention behind the interworking of wood beams in churches, Grace has this a little bit, right? It's meant to look and is designed after upside down boats, the keel and the framing. And there's some Viking churches that are actually
Boats.
Well, they're not boats, but the guys that built them built boats, and they built a boat upside down and just basically stuck it in the ground and put some walls on it. So this is it's an actual thing, but the ark, the church is the ark. It's the thing that the body of Christ dwells in to be safe, right? So the disciples are gathered together in the boat, just as the disciples after the ascension were gathered together in the church to endure, in the text, the storm. The church endures the storms of the world. And Cyril brings up especially persecutions in this case, partly because that's what the disciples had to deal with. They were not dealing with the wind and the waves anymore, but they were dealing with the wind and the wave of people assaulting them for their teaching and hating them because they follow Jesus, they hate Jesus, they'll hate you, right? Those sorts of things. Also, he brings up that, getting hit by the storm of temptation and spiritual darkness and these sorts of things. And to be safe from that, the disciples are gathered together. We are gathered together in the boat at the church. Then the analogy pushes forward, and this is kind of where it comes in. He says, when Christ comes to the church, when does that happen? So after Jesus is ascended, he then appears to the church. When does that occur? There are a couple of correct answers, but there's only one that Cyril pulls out. At the return of Christ. He's looking to the end of the world. Now, you could have said things like, well, the proclamation of his word and the sacraments. That's all true. That's not what he's talking about here, right? He says, Christ returning to the disciples reminds us of Christ's promised return to the church, when the church will see him coming. And we won't be afraid, right? And when we are glad to see Christ in his return, the church gathered in the boat will be immediately delivered from the dangers of the world and brought safely to the shores of eternal life, right? This shores of eternal life thing, that should ring some bells. It's a really old image, but you've probably heard it in good old-timey Southern Baptist spirituals, right? On that golden shore, those sorts of things. This is the kind of, they're getting it more from Jordan and the Promised Land, but that's a legitimate biblical image, even if we're not nearly spiritual enough to sing those songs here, right? So delivered to the safe shores of eternal life. And he has a great little turn of phrase here. He also says that Jesus' return is in the night while the world is, quote, snoring in much sin, which I got to use that in a sermon some days. Bill, you are snoring in much sin, right? It's like, anyway, I'm sure it sounded better in Greek, but anyway, maybe it did, I don't know. But anyway, really clever phrase, right? So, this is the kind of image that, okay, maybe you bring these sorts of things up in a funeral. I wouldn't necessarily pick this text, but maybe that's where they were going as well. So do you see how kind of this spiritual interpretation thing is going? Do you also see why you got to be really careful with it? Because now all of a sudden, if you're not careful, one, you can go off in some weirdo direction, right? And you have dogs licking Ahab's blood as he's dead as an image of communion, right? No, we've gone weird there, right? Another problem, another danger of this kind of interpretation is all of a sudden this is a parable, right? And there are plenty of the ELCA interprets the Bible like this a lot, and other churches that don't confess like the God-breathed total reality of the Bible kind of stuff is, well, when Jesus was walking on the water, he's really telling us about our struggles in the world and his coming again. Well, no, that's not what this is about. Sure, we might be able to learn something about that. And usually, by the way, those kinds of spiritual parable style interpretations are much less faithful. And it's usually like Jesus wants you to row your own boat or something ridiculous like that. And it's also usually used to get out of passages we don't like. So this style of interpretation is good if used proper, right? And John does lend it, like we've talked about a number of times, right? The style of the book of John lends itself to this type of interpretation because of kind of the genre it is. Some of the early church guys aren't, but I would be much more hesitant to use this David and Goliath, right? Maybe not. I use it David and Goliath, so that's a bad example, right? But some of these just David and Bathsheba stuff, that's a better one, right? It's like, well, this is not there are spiritual lessons here, and it's, don't commit sexual violence against other people, and then don't lie about it, and don't get other people killed. Like, that's bad, right? Seek forgiveness, that sort of thing. We don't need to spiritualize that text. We can just take it at face value. Does that make any sense? All right, cool. Questions?
Real quick, who's Cyril?
That's a good question.
I mean, just quick.
Yes, Cyril of Alexandria is a 4th century church father. He was the bishop of Alexandria post the Council of Nicaea.
Okay.
He's an extremely prolific and influential church father. One of the texts I've been using to guide my way through that.
Is he like Lutheran, or is he?
No, this is 1,000 years before Luther.
Okay.
I've been using his commentary on the book of John as some of my material here. Yeah, like I said,
But he's a trustworthy source
Oh,
of the
yeah.
Bible for sure. Huh?
Oh, I think so, and most Christians do. Nestorians don't like him, but that's because he proved that they're heretics and so on. But anyway,
Interesting.
even though, oh man, I got a cool story about Nestorians I can tell you some other time. But he's a very faithful, very intelligent interpreter of Scripture, father of the church. And by the way, shameless plug, Dr. David Maxwell, who is the translator of this text, and it is out. He's also translated Cyril's commentary on Paul's epistles. By the way, this is volume 1 of John. He's got 2. He is not only my professor, which is why I own these books, because I had to read them for a class, which is how professors do things. He's also the presenter at the presentation on the Council of Nicaea that's happening this week up in Dahlonega. So I'm excited to get to see Dr. Maxwell again. He's a fantastic teacher. And Cyril's he's a really good comic. I honestly, though, he's good. I would not recommend you go out and buy his commentary and just read it, because the spiritual stuff that I've been sharing with you is like his low-level spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
His commentary on the baptism of Jesus is some of the most difficult theology I've ever read.
Oh my goodness.
He is. Have you?
Yeah, I like to keep things like that real simple.
Yeah, it's really good. Cyril has a fantastic way of seeing salvation in everything Jesus does.
Oh, wow.
So by the time you're done with, and I asked Dr. Maxwell this, I said, by the time we finished reading through his interpretation and his commentary on Jesus' baptism, like Dr. Maxwell, does Cyril think Jesus needed to die at all? Or are we saved only in Jesus' baptism? And he's like, you might think that. If all you read was that, you would absolutely think that Cyril thought the salvation event was the baptism. He's very convincing, too. But he also recognizes that the cross is the moment of salvation. But so I think it's a much fuller way to understand the ministry of Jesus. It's not like, oh, I think we can get this sense of, for 33 years, Jesus was just not sinning, right? Yeah, he healed some people. Yeah, he did some miracles. He did some teaching. But the big thing he was doing was not sinning so as to screw up the sacrifice later, right? I mean, maybe that's just me and kind of how I used to look at this sort of thing. The way Cyril understands the life of Christ, the way I've come to understand it as well, is everything Jesus does is for you and for your salvation. And so when Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan, the very, 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 very short version of what Cyril says is he undoes Cyril's interpretation of the image of God is that it was lost in the sin of the garden. That was the literal image of God. It was eternal life. It wasn't like lordship or anything like that. It was gone. It got rubbed away in the sin. And what Jesus does in baptism is, again, the very short, no philosophy version of it is it's really dense, is he restamps you in his image. And that happens through your baptism, which connects you to Jesus' baptism. And that's enough to save you, because you have the image of God on you now. And no one that has the image of God cannot be saved, in his way of understanding things. And I think he's right. I think specifically the image of God thing, I think he's right about it, but I also think the other things that we believe are also true. I think that's another bigger picture. But I think it's helpful, and I did preach a sermon on this once right after I read this. It was while I was still a student, where it was an epiphany. No, it was a presentation of Jesus. So Jesus being presented at the temple was all that needed to happen to save you. But he does so much more. Right? So this kind of goes to my prodigal God's prodigal and wasteful with his mercy and grace. Is that, yeah, that would have been enough, but that wasn't God's plan. God's plan was to do so much more. And so like I said, it's much denser, it's much richer and full understanding of what Jesus is doing when you kind of see that every moment of the life of the Savior was for your salvation. Does that make sense? It's a different way to look at this. It's not the way the modern, right? And part of this is that, 1 + 1 = 2. We like our decimal points, enlightenment. We go, well, Jesus saved us on the cross, so we were saved at the cross. It's like, well, yeah, Cyril had no concept of that being a limiting factor. If we said something like that to him, he would likely say, why? Right? Like, why not? Like, God's so much, like, why is your God so small? Is probably what he would say. And then he'd yell at you about the Theotokos for a while. But yeah, anyway, so I wouldn't recommend, unless you really want to spend some time, and I'm happy to walk you through it. But I wouldn't, if you're going to get into the church fathers, don't start with Cyril.
He's saying get rid of the decaf because you're going to need the letters.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me tell you, there were so many times where I was fourth year going, what is this guy saying? We got God by, what is the phrase? By participation. And like I said, you also have to, we started this class with the primer on Platonic philosophy. Because you have to know how Neoplatonism functions to understand what he's saying half the time. Oh. All right, well, wonderful. Look, 5 minutes early, even with Mark's bonus question there, which is a good one, right? If I ever am referencing people you have no idea who I'm talking about, let me know.
I heard it before, but I just didn't.
A reminder. That's good. So let's close with the Lord's Prayer then. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you all. I'll see you next week for